Good afternoon and welcome to the Betsy Wally Stern Conference Center here at the Hudson Institute. I'm John Walters, Chief Operating Officer of Hudson. Welcome. On behalf of the President of Hudson, Ken Weinstein, and our Chair, Sarah Stern, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and I'd like to especially, of course, thank our authors and panelists for making this program possible. My job is to be brief. I will try to meet that. And secondly, my only task is to introduce Eric Taxis, who's going to set up and chair the program today. For many of you, he doesn't need much introduction because he has done many important things that are known to you and to others that will be joining us via television. Perhaps some of you have already read his best-selling book, Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy, which was a New York Times bestseller, and an important book about an important man. In addition, Mr. Taxis was keynote speaker at the 2012 National Prayer Breakfast here in Washington, D.C., and I believe there are copies of that presentation available outside. We're also grateful for him being a participant in this book, Persecuted, which we are releasing today and that this panel is about. He helped to write the foreword and has been an important contributor to the work of the authors of the book. And on behalf of Hudson and them, I want to thank him for that participation. He also, aside from much distinguished work, including the companion to the movie Amazing Grace, William Wilberforce, and the heroic campaign to end slavery, another important man and with important work that needed to be more widely known that he helped to make possible. Mr. Tex has a varied array of interests and, as I said to him earlier, a sense of humor, which for someone who does important work and appears in Washington is not all that common, as some of you here know. He has written for not only the New York Times and many other great publications, but also for Chuck Colson and Veggie Tales, which I personally contributed to in my capacity as a father. So really? I want to thank him for that as well. He also wrote a book entitled Don't You Believe It, a book-length parody of Ripley's Believe It or Not that led novelist Mark Halperin to dub him the true heir to the Far Side's Gary Larson. Now, I actually know people who would love to have that said about them so they could put that on their tombstone. So that may say more about my friends and colleagues at Hudson than it does about anything else. But I want to thank him for being here. His important work on the topics of faith, truth, justice, and freedom are well known to most people here, and we hope to benefit from his continued collaboration with our authors. So without any further ado, let me introduce Mr. Metaxas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. A lot of that actually is true, so thank you. Yes, it's because of my parody of the Ripley's Believe It or Not books that I was invited, obviously, to moderate this panel today. So I want to thank you for knowing of the existence of that book. It's available for $400 on eBay, I think. There's one copy left. No, I hope I'm not here because of that, although I'm glad that someone's aware of it. I'm here probably for many reasons. Most significant, I hope, is my concern for the issue of persecution of not only Christians, but of anyone for religious reasons around the world. This is something that obviously gets very little coverage, it seems to me. So when I was asked to write the foreword for this brand new book, Persecuted, by these three distinguished authors, I was profoundly honored and thrilled to do it. There's so much to talk about, and we will get to that. I've just got a brief 45-minute presentation, then we're going to get to the three of you any minute. I could probably do it in 42 if I talk fast, so you hang on to your hats. Thank you for laughing. That's not true. I will be extraordinarily brief. I only really want to say up front that I think that what drew me into the subject of persecution, Christian persecution, and religious freedom was writing my book on Bonhoeffer. This was not something about which I knew very much at all. I confess to having been ignorant, mostly ignorant about it. But I say that only because I know that I'm speaking to many people. There are many people watching at home and who will hear about this, who are ignorant about this. And I think that particularly the American church is tremendously ignorant about this. And as someone who proudly considered himself a non-card-carrying member of the American church, to have been ignorant about this for so long tells me that we aren't talking about this enough. And so it's a privilege for me to do my part, because I do think this is at the heart of so many issues, not least what is freedom in the world. It just touches on so much. It's like stem cells that you hardly know where to begin. One thing I saw from the Bonhoeffer book is that when religious freedom begins to be eclipsed, it leads inevitably to genuine persecution. And I do think that in America, suddenly, religious freedom is being very seriously threatened. No one seems to be talking about it. I just spoke about it at CPAC, of all places, not the kind of place where people seem to be so interested in it. But I do think that this is vital. It's a vital issue to so many things, and again, not least because it leads to genuine persecution, which we are seeing around the world in such measure that we can hardly believe it. But again, most of us are ignorant of it. That's why I'm so excited about this book. This book, for anybody out there of, I would say, a kind of guttering faith, let me say, if you read this book, it will profoundly strengthen your faith. So be careful if you decide to read it, but it will strengthen what faith you have. If you have no faith, it may give you some. So let's leave it at that. I think that there's so many questions I want to ask the panel. In a little bit, we'll open things up for the audience. Our panel, I hope you know who's sitting here. You know Lela Gilbert, Paul Marshall, and Nina Shea. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But they have asked me, they prefer true or false questions. Is that right? Am I getting that right? And if you can't come up with a true or false question, then multiple choice at most. So thank you very much. And number 2, pencils. So anyway, I will ask the first question, then I'll sit down. I really mean to facilitate a conversation. This is not a Jeopardy thing. You know that. There are no buzzers, and there are no right or wrong answers. We really want to facilitate a conversation. So my first question before I sit down, and I will, is why did you write this book? Now, if that's not enough of a softball, I've got other softballs. But why did you write this book, and how can we get this wonderful product will be my follow-up question. But in all seriousness, for any of you, you don't all have to answer this, but that's the main question. I've got some thoughts on that, but we're interested in your thoughts. So anyone who wants to lead off, and we'll just have our conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate your taking the time to be here and to really draw public attention to this important story. All of us, and I'll let my colleagues speak for themselves, have been working on this issue of documenting religious freedom violations and Christian persecution for many years, and we have actually other books dating from 16 years ago on the same subject. So we thought we would combine forces this time and really highlight the fact that religious persecution is one of the gravest human rights abuses of our day, and that Christians are the most persecuted, widely persecuted group in the world today. And that is not just our finding, it's also been reinforced by Pew Research Center, the Economist, Newsweek magazine, the Vatican, Compass Direct, and so on. So it is almost irrefutable at this point that Christians are the most widely persecuted religious group out of sheer numbers. They are located globally, while there are Tibetan Buddhists persecuted certainly in China, and there's Ahmadi Muslims persecuted in Pakistan. Christians are founded in both places and are persecuted in both places. So this is a story that's not very well known in America. It's not widely reported. And the churches themselves do not even really take notice sometimes. And we just thought that it was time, again, to retell this story Some of you in this room have been working with us for many, many years on this issue, and we had a great deal of success 16 years ago when we got the work together in coalition with many churches and human rights groups to have Congress adopt and the President Clinton at the time to sign the International Religious Freedom Act. And that has led to some good State Department reporting on these issues, but we feel that this is at another time of a great wave of persecution when not too many people are paying attention.
Yeah, I would just second all that and add that it's a phenomenon which is growing in the last 10 to 15 years. And to reinforce one of the points that Nina made, that people in North America, are, whether they're inside churches or outside of them, usually don't know about this. If there's a particular horrendous incident, say the bombing of the cathedral in Baghdad or bombing of churches in Egypt, then it may get in the news, it may get on CNN, but then it dies away again. But the actual phenomena is continuing. Not necessarily with 65 people dead, but 10, 12 people dead. So there's very little awareness of what is happening around the world, and in some cases there's very little awareness of the existence of Christian communities in these places. In many cases, communities which are 2,000 years old.
Paul and I wrote a book together in 97, I think it came out, called Their Blood Cries Out. And we covered the same issue. The book became more and more out of date as the problems increased in the world. I had kind of set aside the problem of Christian persecution when I went to Jerusalem in 2006. But to my surprise, it crossed my path over and over again in Jerusalem, because being a crossroads, people came from Turkey, people came from Gaza, people came from all over the Middle East with terrible stories about what was going on to their communities. Christian teachers, Christian missionaries, and Christians that were indigenous to certain areas that were leaving. And I began to see the increase in this, and of course watching now the Arab Spring explode, Arab Spring in quotes as we always say. It's made things so much worse, and it's not looking like it's going to get any better. So we began to talk about this a couple of years ago, but it became necessary to update and to give a current report on what's going on. Unfortunately, things are changing quickly. I think we might have put Egypt in a different chapter if we did it yesterday, but we have at least an up-to-date report now.
Before we get to Egypt, and we must, I just want to follow up to what you were saying, Paul. You said that this is increasing. The obvious question, why is this increasing?
Most of the increase is focused in the Muslim majority world. There's more Christians persecuted in China, Vietnam, and so on. That goes up and down, but it's relatively stable. And if I can just add on that, China doesn't have an export model. The Chinese don't much care what somebody else does in their own country. They're just saying, don't interfere with us here. But you're getting increased radicalization in much of Islam. And that's where you're seeing these increases. Countries which were comparatively free 10 or 15 years ago, places like Indonesia, or even more recently Mali, now you're getting continuing attacks. In Indonesia, probably now hundreds of attacks on churches per year. So you see this increase, and Islamist groups, whether sort of outright terrorists like Al-Qaeda, or just ones of extremist groups, the Salafists in Egypt and elsewhere, very much want other people to do the same. So they're trying, with some success, to get other Muslim countries to get with their own program. So it's increasing in intensity and it's increasing in spread. That's where it's mainly happening.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that this is a Muslim issue. So then the question is, ultimately, if there's an increase, when you say there's an increase, it's a Muslim issue. So what does this mean? This means that Muslims around the world who had not previously been radicalized are being radicalized and are being led to believe that an expression of their faith is this kind of persecution of Christians specifically?
There's certainly Muslims who are not radicalized are becoming so. You see Indonesia again, or take Malaysia, Senegal, Mali. These are countries which are historically free. I edited a World Survey of Religious Freedom about 5 years ago, and two Muslim majority countries, Mali and Senegal, scored higher than France. But now you're seeing these attacks there. So there's definitely a radicalization. You've seen this pattern in Egypt now. It's happening now in Syria. It's happened in Libya. It's happened in Iraq. So more Muslims are becoming radicalized, and many other Muslims are, of course, deeply worried about this because they become targets as well.
Yeah, I just want to add that we, the same forces that persecute Christians are also persecuting the Ahmadis and the Baha'is and the other minorities. In the Middle East, Christians are the largest non-Muslim minority. So they're taking the brunt of this. But Muslims are definitely affected, individual Muslims as well as groups. And just to give a few examples of what's happening right now, there's an American pastor imprisoned and facing possible death, Saeed Abedini, in Iran right this minute.
Is he an American citizen?
Yeah.
He is an American citizen of Iranian origin.
Well, but he's an American citizen.
But he's an American citizen. I think he was sentenced to 8 years, but often these sentences mean nothing and can be changed at will, at whim by the
Okay, but an
courts
American
there.
citizen, just to underscore this as
American
much as
citizen.
possible, an American citizen is being held for his religious beliefs in Iran now.
For apostasy in Iran
Okay.
now.
So the question, of course, is what has the American government done about this thus far?
Well, not enough. Secretary Kerry issued a statement finally after 8 months of imprisonment. He issued a statement on Friday night at the minute after the business week closed at 6:01 p.m., talking about Mr. Abedini and expressing concern. He never mentioned that he was a Christian pastor or that he's being basically sentenced for apostasy. But this is happening, Paul referred to Libya. Churches have been attacked there in recent weeks. This month, a Coptic Christian was from Egypt in Libya, was tortured to death. In Egypt itself, there's a mother of 7 children who was just sentenced. Her entire family was sentenced to 15 years. Her name is Nadia Muhammad Ali, for converting to Christianity. Actually, she reconverted to Christianity.
But before we go into these, because I want to hear more about you, I know there are a number of specific cases, but I just want to go back to Pastor Saeed Abedini, an American citizen who's being held in Iran right now, and you implied that our State Department has some kind of reticence about speaking out, that this was kind of done at the end of the day on Friday. I assume you're saying for some reason deliberately, and that the idea that he was the fact that he's a Christian pastor was also not mentioned. I want to know why do you think the administration, what would their reasons be, whether legitimate or illegitimate, for doing this at the end of a week when traditionally, obviously, things are put out there so they don't get attention? Why would the current administration do that? What would their reasons be for not being more vocal about it, or for not mentioning that it's a Christian pastor? Or is that just an oversight?
I can't believe it's an oversight, and there's a pattern here. And there were also, Congressman Frank Wolf on the Tom Lantos Commission in Congress held a hearing on Iran last week, and the administration refused to send a witness. So that's,
refused to send
a witness to this hearing to talk about Pastor Abedini.
But can you guess why that would be? Because I'm not conversant on these things, and so you'll have to help us.
It's misguided multiculturalism, an unwillingness to, political correctness, unwillingness to say that Christians are victims. in that part of the world. I think it's trying to be nice, trying to be liked, and I can't find any other explanation of why.
Has that ever worked?
No, no, it really doesn't. And in fact, we have case after case where people have been freed from prison, and there are two Iranian Christian converts who are now in the United States who were imprisoned in '09. They just wrote a fascinating book called Captives in Iran, where they were saved by the Voice of America reporting their story. It prompted Amnesty International and Jubilee campaign, which they credit in their book, of getting them out, of sending thousands of letters on their behalf and freeing them. So it's just the opposite effect, really. It sends the wrong signal.
Yeah, if I can add to this, the Iranians, in terms of individual cases, if there's enough exposure, it usually works. I mean, they back off death sentences or declare someone insane and then release them and they flee out of the country. One reason the State Department, let me also add that it's a fairly common pattern if you're dealing with Christians. The U.S. government statements do not say what religion they are. It's just these things happen to these people and it's bad. One reason they offer for that, which may have some plausibility in the case of Iran, is we don't want to single out that they're Christians because they say, well, America's defending Christians, all the Christians getting together, and so forth. But a country like Iran says that anyway. And if you're dealing, say, with Baha'is in Iran, the State Department very properly will say they're in prison because they're Baha'is. So in other cases, it will refer to the reason. But in Christians, not always, but very often, it doesn't.
I would also add that Paul and Nina wrote a book called Silenced, which had to do with the discomfort in the West of speaking against radical Islam, and how there's been an intentional move within the Islamic world, as well as the cooperation within the Western world, to keep a lid on that issue. And so I think some of what is reflected in not taking a strong stand, or maybe avoiding making this Monday morning news, is kind of keeping that quiet. That would be my guess as well. And we all try to be careful because we all know people that are Muslim that are anything but terrorists. They're working very hard, but it's become sort of stigmatized to address it at all.
I mean, is this just a kind of a typical and lamentable left-right divide that, when Reagan is president, he'll call the Soviet Union an evil empire, and everyone on the left will attack him and say that's not helpful, that's going to cause trouble. But his thesis would be that, on the contrary, this kind of confrontation is good because it projects strength, and we must project strength, and that's all they listen to. And this seems to be, when I hear that Kerry would have done this kind of thing, that his thesis would be that we don't want to confront, that's going to be counterproductive, but you're suggesting that confrontation, in fact, is the way to deal with these kinds of issues. Is that fair?
When we say confrontation, let's be clear, we're not talking military confrontation here. And but if there was a hiker, as there have been, abducted in Iran, the State Department has no hesitancy to come out and to make a major issue of these cases. But it seems like when Christians are involved, there is, they shy away. And, another example of this, and it actually is found in both Republican and Democratic administrations on some very key issues, Bush on Iraq. And, but in 2010, there was the last church in Afghanistan was shut down by the Karzai government, or it was a 99-year lease. It was canceled by a court, and that was the last remaining church in Afghanistan. Our diplomats, our defense contractors now have to go and hide their worship behind walled compounds. Afghanistan, while the surge was going on, over 100,000 American troops on the ground, joined Saudi Arabia as the only other country in the world that became so intolerant that they do not have a single church. And the Obama administration knew about it and actually reported about it in the State Department Religious Freedom Report, which is still the gold standard for human rights reporting. But at the time that it was happening, they said nothing and did nothing. And so on our watch, this has happened. And the Bush administration, two-thirds of the Christians of Iraq were driven out. And we have it in the book about some conversations we had with Secretary Rice at the time, saying, please speak up for them, please protect them. Again, we had 100,000 troops on the ground. And she said, no, we cannot get involved in sectarian affairs. And meanwhile, the United States had just installed a Shiite government in Iraq and was negotiating on behalf of Sunni leaders to get Sunni appointments in the government. So, it just didn't ring true.
I mean, it does seem as I listen, because I'm being educated on this as I listen here, that some rights are more equal than others, right? In other words, if we're talking about a universal concept or standard of, let's say, women's rights, then we can speak out against it. But it seems that there has been a shying away from doing that with regard to religious liberty, that we are, at least it seems to me, at least the current administration, but to some extent the previous administration, is willing to some extent to throw this under the bus for what they perceive as a greater good of peace. But it sounds like it's not working.
Yeah, it's. I think that's happening. For a while, the President Obama and then also Secretary of State Clinton got into the habit of using the expression freedom of worship, which would be about 10% of freedom of religion. Most of religion involves other things other than worship. And there was enough criticism that they stopped, but it was very worrying that they did that. Another rhetorical device is to speak about religious toleration, which is sort of, why can't we all get along? Well, I like religious toleration, but it's not the same thing as religious freedom. Religious freedom is the legal right to do certain things, even if you do happen to be intolerant.
Yeah.
So there's an attempt to sort of redefine the issue and put it out of the way, but it's certainly not given the centrality it deserves. One important thing we want to emphasize, and Lela mentioned the book which Nina and I had called Silenced, and one of the main things there, we look at blasphemy codes in the Muslim world and make the point that this stifles debate within Islam and it empowers the radicals. Because liberal Muslims, by which liberal in this context I mean committed to freedom, don't condemn radicals as blasphemers. It goes the other way around. So freedom-loving Muslims are the ones who are silenced. And if you want good things to come out of, say, the Arab Spring, you can't have the sort of blasphemy codes which are going around, which cut down debate, and that's a religious freedom issue. The Pew Forum, Brian Grimm, Roger Finke, and others have done studies of the effects of religious freedom on the status of women, economic development, economic growth, militarization, and it all has strong positive effects. And there's a very good correlation of religious freedom and economic growth. It goes both ways. So there's also this problem we often face, that religious freedom is regarded as something on the side. It's what you do on Sunday. But if you don't have religious freedom, you will not have democratic development in any country in the world.
I want to just touch on that, this difference between freedom of worship and freedom of religion. I recently spoke about that. I don't normally speak about this subject, but there is, as you said, a tremendous difference. It's almost laughable to use them interchangeably. I know that Hillary Clinton infamously, something like 18 months ago, was talking about freedom of worship, and Chuck Colson, the late Chuck Colson, noticed this and began to speak out against it. And it's when I got involved in these issues and I thought, my goodness, this is a chilling thing, because freedom of worship, they have freedom of worship in China. They had freedom of worship in the Third Reich. Freedom of worship is laughable. It means you can go into a little building and do your little weird religious rituals, but the moment you come out of that building, after your little 90 minutes or 2 hours, you belong to us, and your whatever it is that you believe must bow to the secular or other orthodoxy of the state. So that's a lack of religious freedom, and it's important, I think, for folks who don't know it, and again, I didn't know it really till recently, but that this idea of religious freedom, which is at the heart of the ordered freedoms in America, is the kind of freedom that must be expressed outside of the place where one worships. In other words, it has to do with the freedom of ideas, the freedom of conscience, and the idea of freedom of worship or tolerance, as you mentioned it, is a very far cry from genuine religious freedom. And so I just want to thank you for making that point and want to underscore it, because I think, again, those of us who have only come to this recently don't realize that freedom of worship is practically meaningless. Those are weasel words if I've ever heard them.
One of the issues that immediately comes to mind with this is what we used to call witnessing as Christians or evangelizing is now called proselytizing. And it's become a dirty word. And it's also in many Muslim countries and also in China, I believe, too, trying to spread Christianity, which is one of the tenets of the Gospels, which is the call to spread the word, is illegal and therefore does not fall into the category of religious freedom. But that word has become a dirty word even in America now.
Yeah, what we Christians call sharing the good news.
Right.
It's actually a basic human right, and the UN, to its credit, put out a very important report on this very subject about how it is a grave human rights concern that evangelizing or proselytizing is now repressed in so many countries.
I mean, it's a free speech issue.
Yeah, well, it's a freedom of religion issue. The UN Special Rapporteur on Religion says that this goes really to the heart of religious freedom, to be able to talk about your beliefs to others and to teach others about your beliefs. So that it's a free speech issue, it's a freedom of association issue, and it's a freedom of religion.
Okay, so since we're talking specifically about this widespread and increased persecution of Christians around the world, let me ask this question. Why isn't the American church, or the Western church, but specifically the American church, speaking out about this issue, or are they?
Certainly some members of the church are speaking out about this. There are very dedicated organizations which work on this, and there are congregations which work on this. But I would say, compared to 15 years ago, there's much less attention to this issue in the American churches. People very quickly want to become introverted, introverted within, about the situation within the United States. Often, particularly if I'm doing call-in radio on this issue, one of the first calls is always going to be, yeah, but we're persecuted here in America as well. My reply to that is that, well, there are problems here, and they're increasing problems, and they deserve attention. But whatever show I'm on, I can say, but I know this program deals with that a lot. We don't deal with what I'm talking about, so I just want to focus on that. So I think that's important. And
I think political correctness has grown, really, and even in the churches.
Political correctness,
even,
that it's leached into the churches,
and, yeah, and not, again, this misguided multiculturalism. We don't want to insult anybody, and don't want to be unpleasant. We want to get along. So I think that's a big part of it.
Well, okay, this leads at least me inevitably to two unpleasant words, Dennis Rodman. Or maybe I can swap out North Korea. You, in your book and in other places, have talked about the horrors of North Korea. When the generally misguided Dennis Rodman, misguidedly, in my estimation, went over there, I thought two things. I thought that this is like, Jane Fonda sitting on the gun. And I'd love to be corrected on this, but it struck me that this was a way to prop up a murderous regime committing some of the worst atrocities along the lines which you've described in your book. What is your perception of that? And do you think that our State Department could have done anything to prevent this, or they knew about this? Because I frankly was so stunned, especially since it's North Korea. This is, There's gray areas, and then there's North Korea. So what do you all think about that, and what do you think of the role one plays in doing things like that? I mean, reaching out in that way. It seems to me, as I said, misguided, naive, but what do you think? Can anything good come of it?
Let me just comment first on the situation in North Korea, then I'm going to defer to my co-panelists to say what you do about it. But the North Korea is probably the worst place to be any number of things. Being a human being there is probably the worst. But it's probably also the worst place to be a Christian. Persecution is the most intensive. I just want to go back to North Korea, but use that as an intro to the sort of the communist, post-communist world, with China, Vietnam, Laos, still Cuba, and North Korea standing out on its own. And then the old post-Soviet countries, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Belarus. There's widespread persecution in these countries too. And in terms of total numbers, that affects more Christians, mainly because of China, than phenomena in the Muslim world. So that's another huge pattern which is there and which we look at. But you very correctly say that North Korea stands on its own. But
yeah, I don't have any insights into Dennis Rodman.
Neither does Dennis Rodman. So.
But it is, people, we have cases that we discuss in our book about North Koreans being shot, summarily executed for being found in possession of a Bible. Families to 3 generations being put in their detention camp system because of they've been revealed to be Christians. It is the worst repressive country in the world, and then you have only 5 churches there. As one of our cases says, they're all fake. They're there for Western benefit. It's there to fool the West. But this is going on in China to a lesser extent, but they have moved to a more regulatory system where we find throughout the world. It puts a more, as countries become more involved in international trade, they become more self-conscious about human rights, and they don't use we're not seeing so much the brutal methods as we've seen in the past. In a place like China, the pastors and priests may be put in the laogai, the work camps, but they also are just as likely to be put into retirement homes for detention, a kind of house arrest. In Vietnam, they're still bulldozing monasteries and churches and graveyards to put in ecotourism resorts. So this and get particularly brutal in the outlying areas where the international media is not present, among the Hmong people or the Montagnards in the remote tribal areas. So Dennis Rodman is one way that they are trying to, whatever Dennis Rodman was thinking, we will never know. But what the North Koreans were thinking, what Pyongyang was thinking, was that we're going to use this guy to fool the West, as they do the.
I would say not only to fool the West. Again, I think of the corollary of the Soviet Union when somebody would go over there and have a photo op, that it served to prop up that regime. And my understanding is that prisoners in the gulags would suffer when that happened. When someone would speak out heroically, as Reagan did a couple of times, their situation would improve. So it seems to me that Rodman was used. But I guess another question, just because I'm interested in our own administration, our own government's role, would they not have known that he was going over there, and would they not have at least had to give some tacit approval to this? Did they not care? Do you have any sense of that? Because I was just stunned that this could even occur.
He'd have to have a visa of some kind, which would have.
I don't know. I don't know how he went. Whether he went through China or some other third country. So I really don't have any insights into that.
Can you make some up?
It happened after the book was written, Eric, so we haven't done our research on Dennis Rodman.
But I just add, I think, if the North Koreans thought they could use Dennis Rodman this way, it backfired. I mean, this is the regime that when The Onion named the president the sexiest man in the world, replayed it as a serious news story. So, Dennis Rodman is not the guy who's going to sort of convince the West, and he was really put down there. But how he got in and whatever, I don't know.
I think it might be worth pointing out that because we talked a lot about Islam, why the communist countries persecute Christians. And what we've talked about in the past on this subject is that Christians bow to a higher authority. And although this is not religious persecution, a guy in a plane said to me on the way here, he said, religion is responsible for all the brutality in the world, all the wars in the world. We need to get rid of religion. And this is a common statement.
Yeah.
These countries are not religious. They're anti-religious because Christians will not bow the knee to a lesser God. And I think that's why we have to remember that we're dealing with atheism of a sort. I mean, it sort of becomes religious in its own way, but it is atheism.
Well, yeah.
But it's so threatened by Christians and other people of faith that they strike out just as violently as if it were a religion.
I think we're supposed to transition to audience questions. Is this who has the timing on that? I think we are. Is that right? Somebody wink at me. There we are. Thank you. So we're gonna do that. As I said before, only true or false questions, please. And let me ask one final question. Or actually, maybe I'll save it to the end. All right. So if anybody who's got a question, you'll have to limit it to 14 syllables.
And wait for the microphone.
The gentleman, what's
You'll
that?
have to wait for the
Is there a
microphone.
microphone being passed around? All right.
And please identify yourself.
The microphone will be moved to, here it comes. And if you don't mind, actually we do have a serious rule. You have to please frame your question in the form of a question.
Yeah, not a declaration.
Thank you. Okay, there's a gentleman here who had his hand up, and no, right there, you just passed him. The man with his hand up. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Just going to Iran for just a moment, Nina, in particular, in Libya. Going back to Iran for just a minute, and Pastor Abedin, in Libya, we have an American in jail for proselytizing as well, an American citizen. He was arrested with a South African and 6 others. There is nothing from the State Department, nor will there be anything from the State Department, because, and this is the question, are we not doing this main enemy routine that we had with the Soviet Union, that we pick Iran up, and we're only going to talk about persecution of Christians in Iran, nowhere else, because we view Libya and Egypt and all the other Muslim Brotherhood-controlled nations, no matter what they do, whether they arrest Americans or not, that's okay because they're against Iran. And we are in our main enemy routine the way we were in the Soviet Union when we armed the Mujahideen.
I think that was more than 14 syllables, but we'll let it go.
Well,
thank you.
That was what was so mystifying about Secretary Kerry's statement, where it didn't even mention the fact that he was Christian or that he was being sentenced essentially for apostasy. So, even if Iran is the main hostile force, we're not even willing to speak up really much there either. So I wouldn't even go that far as far as you've gone.
Yeah, there is that pattern, I think, of sort of going easy on our friends or people who want to be our friends. So there tends to be more of a concentration, say, on Iran, and sort of less outspoken on Afghanistan about what happens there. Or
You'd mentioned
Saudi
Egypt
Arabia.
earlier. I don't know if you want to...
Egypt too. Just to mention, by the way, several months ago, an Egyptian court sentenced several Americans to death in connection with that movie trailer thing, The Innocence of Muslims. And included Pastor Terry Jones, who's not one of my favorite people. But when foreign courts are condemning Americans to death for exercising their First Amendment rights within the United States, I think that there should be some comment about that.
Microphone to the front row, possibly. Here it comes.
My name is Fred Weber. True or false? All right, Eric. The dramatic rise in the persecution of Christians worldwide, but especially in the Muslim countries, is a direct result of the rise in opposition to our country, to the anti-American feeling that's been crescendoing, especially in this past decade.
I'm not sure that is the case. Within the Muslim world, I think some of that is connected, or at least when you get with radical Islam, if you go through Al-Qaeda statements, things of this kind, then you will see America is hated because it's thought to be Christian. Christians are not hated because they're thought to be American. They see the world in religious terms. Bin Laden, says, the Buddhists have a seat on the UN Security Council, why can't we? What's he referring to? He's referring to China. So they put them, everything is put in religious categories. So Christians would be seen as a problem anyway. Just add another rider, because we cover 60 or 70 countries in the book. Don't want to get down in the weeds of each individual country, but most of the rise is in the Muslim world. But increasing attacks in Sri Lanka. Since the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, thankfully that is over, but that also means that the government is now feeling more confident, and attacks on religious minorities, Muslims and Christians, have increased. So you see there are problems elsewhere, but the big increase is in the Muslim majority world.
And while the microphone is moving to the next one, I want to know, when do we lose C-SPAN, at 15 after or at 30 after? Does anyone know? 30, that's what I thought. Thank you. Okay. Proceed to a raised hand. I'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Nathan Hollenbeck with Coptic Orphans. Recently, our organization in Egypt won official government registration after an 8-year process with a lot of back and forth. At one point, the Egyptian media reported that registration had been denied to Coptic orphans as well as to others like the Carter Center for, quote, threats to national sovereignty. So that's a preface now to my 14-syllable question, which is, what in situations like Egypt, where there's a strong phobia about foreign money, foreign political influence, how do we work without exposing indigenous Christians, as we've seen, even among our indigenous staff, to charges of being foreign spies, working for anti-national political interests?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I think the key, the operative phrase is foreign money. In other words, U.S. money. I mean, we are basically we're promising Egypt's government upwards of $10 billion, either through our direct aid, military aid, economic aid, debt forgiveness, $2 billion debt forgiveness, approval for IMF loans, worth about $5 billion right there. So the Egyptian government is not at all adverse to foreign money. It's just adverse to, it wants it for itself, but not for anybody else in civic society. And we have to use our leverage. We have to put some conditions on our foreign aid to protect the rights of minorities, to protect human rights, and to promote our interests in Egypt, such as flourishing of real democracy, of liberal democracy, and a strong civic society. That's the only way that, the other interesting thing about, Paul had mentioned the correlations between women's rights and religious freedom and so forth. There's also the converse is true. When there is religious repression and restrictions, there's instability, and Pew has documented this. So it's in our own national interest, not just our ideals, to have to ensure that a country respects the rights of its nationals, of its citizens. So I think that the answer is that we have to start making clear that we expect religious freedom and protection for the cops and protection for human rights in general with our generous aid.
Yeah, just to add to that in terms of with Egyptian NGOs of all kinds. So lots of American money goes into Egypt, but the government wants it all and has cut off others. The second thing is there's lots of foreign money going into Egypt from the Gulf. And that's I haven't seen any documentation of that, but all the reliable people I know say it is the case. So it's only certain types of money. Of course, that doesn't help an NGO if it runs afoul of laws on foreign money. I think the main thing would be, what does the organization itself want? Saadettin Ibrahim, the democracy and human rights activist in Egypt, was commenting on this a year or two back and said, ask the organization. It's probably the best judge of its own risks and what it needs. So that's all I can suggest on that score.
I'm John Rosamondo with the Investigative Project on Terrorism. Our organization tracks the domestic Islamist groups that are affiliated with the Brotherhood, such as the Council on American Islamic Relations, Islamic Society of North America, and we've been able to see that there's been a close correlation between these groups and the lobbying the Obama administration. I mean, they've come out and supported the Brotherhood in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. Do you think that they're having any impact on how the administration deals with indigenous Christians in the Muslim world?
Yeah, quick canvas. We would have no idea on what are the dynamics there. We just observe the phenomena that the current administration, and that's also mentioned, as Nina did before, with the Bush administration, at least as far as we're dealing with Iraq, did not raise this issue, did not focus on the persecution of Christians. So I think there are many dynamics, including the sort of one of political correctness, whereby the U.S. and also the U.S. doesn't want to be seen as a Christian nation simply defending Christians. These other motives operate, but how the decision-making goes on, I don't know.
And I think that there's a blind spot in our, Paul's going to plug his book, Blind Spot. It's okay, Paul, you can put it up, about when journalists don't get religion. But I think there's also a blind spot in our
Excuse me, you've only written one book on that subject? I'm sorry to hear that.
There's a blind spot in our embassy there, and they've made a couple of obvious missteps recently. One was bringing over a woman that Sam Todros on our staff, who's in the back there, uncovered the fact that she was to get a Human Rights Award, an Egyptian national who had tweeted her congratulations for the attacks on 9/11 against the United States, and wanted to see America burn and that kind of thing, and also attacks on Israel and Jews and celebrating jihadist attacks. And so when that was uncovered, the State Department, of course, was horribly embarrassed and sent her packing home without the award. On the anniversary of 9/11 last fall, the embassy, when the YouTube trailer that Paul mentioned came out, the embassy put up a statement saying that this was an abuse of freedom of speech. This is the same kind of characterization that Egypt's government itself has used for many years in the UN, that we must not abuse freedom of speech, therefore we need to have international blasphemy laws. So I think there's a problem coming from that embassy as well.
Yeah, if I can just add, since Nina mentioned that this book, blind spot when journalists don't get religion. One of my co-editors was Lela Gilbert. One of the phenomena we explore in this is that most journalists, with of course many honorable exceptions, don't understand religion. Here I'm not talking about persecution, and here I'm not talking about Christianity alone. It's just, in general, many have a very secular mindset, which itself is okay, but actually don't really know what goes on outside that bubble. And so there are many things they miss, they just don't see. So if you're dealing with persecution, it can sometimes happen in the capitals of countries, but often it's in remote areas. And if you're in the capital talking to other journalists and you're talking to diplomats and other people, and that's your world, then often you don't know what's going on in the country you cover. So there's a more general phenomena of journalists missing things. So.
Yes, Emmanuel Ogebe with Jubilee Campaign. You mentioned that North Korea is the worst place in the world for Christians. The World Watch Monitor has said that Nigeria is the most violent place in the world for Christians. Now, of course, I imagine that you can distinguish between the two because one is state-sponsored persecution and the other is a sect-sponsored persecution. But given that Nigeria had more Christians killed than the rest of the world put together in 2012, could you maybe speak to this and try and reconcile the two, the dissonance between the two? Thank you.
Yeah, obviously there's a variety of dimensions when we're talking about persecution. You may have noticed we said that Christians are the most widely persecuted group, that is persecuted in more countries and involves more people than any other group in the world. We wouldn't want to, I steer clear of saying the most persecuted because I'm not sure what that means. Like Baha'is are more intensively persecuted, so are Ahmadis, but they're much smaller, so it's much less widespread and involves fewer people. Similarly, for myself at least, when I refer to North Korea, and I think all of us do, as the worst place, there is no Christian in North Korea who is not persecuted. I mean, it's there, it's total, it's repressive. In Nigeria, you have 55, 60 million Christians. And as you correctly say, the death toll is in the thousands. And this is another area that the State Department has been reluctant to speak out on some of these issues. So in terms of death toll, then obviously more Christians are killed in Nigeria than anywhere else. We probably should spend more attention on this because it's also one of the largest Christian communities in the world. But it's the intensity in North Korea of how many Christians. We don't know how many there are, but probably 200,000. Every one of them is persecuted. In Nigeria, with 60 million, there are thousands of deaths. But for many Christians in Lagos and so on, they're not facing that. It's as you know, mainly in the Middle Belt and the North. So that's the way we're using the terms. There are many dimensions of which we can get at countries.
And there is no doubt that there is horrific persecution in Nigeria. And last Easter, we're coming up to Easter this Sunday, and last Easter, of course, a series of churches were bombed, full of worshipers, and this has happened repeatedly, over and over again. I think in June, like every Sunday, that we saw a church bombing, and then again more recently. So it's just a horrific situation. And again, the link between stability and religious freedom could not be clearer. And the State Department really should be making this a priority instead of giving speeches, as the Assistant Secretary did after the Easter bombing at one of the other think tanks in town, saying that this had nothing to do with religion. I mean, Boko Haram, the author of these attacks, very name means Western education is prohibited as a sin. So, and has has not tried to hide the fact that they want to impose an Islamic State on the country, and really cleanse the area of Christians, so-called religious cleansing.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add that I think Jubilee has just issued a report at least Anne Bawalda, I got it in an email. Emmanuel and I were together in Istanbul last week, and sort of documenting the number of attacks and how many were killed, because there's a lot of confusion on that score.
Hi, Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Thank you all for the book and for your moderation, Eric. My question is, I'm seeing in my own work a tendency of our government and media and others to make the perpetrators into the victims. And I wondered if you talk about that at all, and about the idea of moral equivalence, which we definitely see with Boko Haram, where the State Department has chosen to call them victims rather than perpetrators. Thank you.
Okay, this does happen. An example you have given that often Boko Haram attacks are labeled religious clashes or sectarian clashes when they're not. I mean, there have been religious clashes in Nigeria, deaths on both sides. But Boko Haram, is a terrorist organization. It's bombing churches almost every Sunday. There's a tendency to say, well, it kills Muslims as well, which it certainly does. I mean, it killed traditional Muslim leaders, then attacks the military, the police, and the government. But its focus on, killing police and other things isn't because they're Muslim, it's because they represent the state. So it's attacking the state and Christians. And so that gets miscast, because there are obviously Muslim deaths at the hands of Boko Haram, as, well, then it's not religious. And they're called sectarian clashes. This still goes on in newspaper and sometimes even State Department coverage of Egypt. That if there's a conflict, they call it a sectarian clash. To which my reply is, no, it's a pogrom. I mean, that's like calling the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s in the South. There were racial clashes in Alabama last night, and 25 people were killed. It's not. The violence is, there may be retaliatory violence, but the aggression is going one way. And how many mosques in Egypt have been burned or attacked? To my knowledge, 0. But large numbers of churches. Again, I don't want to say that all Muslims are attacking all Christians or anything of this kind. But in terms of the violence, it's not just a clash between two forces. It's radical Islamists versus the rest, and Christians are one of the principal targets.
Well, one of the cases we talk about in the book is the Maspero massacre in October 11 and in Cairo. And these were a group of Copts that got together, mostly Coptic youth that got together with some Muslims, to protest the burning of their churches that had been going on, where the government failed to come to their rescue or to give them any protection. And the government set out to break up this protest by opening fire with live ammunition on the protesters and running them over with tanks. And the pictures are up on the internet today, and they're just grotesque and horrific.
When was this, Nina?
This was in October 31st, 11. This is just the beginning of the Arab Spring. It was the first year of the Arab Spring. And I remember, I never forget how the U.S. government put out a response condemning it and saying that, asking for both sides to refrain from further violence.
Because some of the tanks were damaged.
Sam Tadros wrote at the time on NRO, he said, maybe I should tell the military to stand down from killing the cops, and I should tell the cops to stop dying. But it's a perfect example of that phenomenon. And
I just want to ask a question, because this, as I said at CPAC, I gave a speech about this and how we seem to have lost the understanding in America, where it's the one place where I think we had this understanding of ordered liberty, and how you cannot have so-called democracy or self-government without the protection of religious freedom. And it seems to me that both Republicans and Democrats have gotten this woefully wrong. You can't just sprinkle democracy dust and you get democracy if you do not have built in protection for minorities and religious freedom. And the Arab Spring, quote unquote, seems to me a classic example of this idea that we're willing to tolerate certain things so we can get democracy because we believe democracy will lead to all kinds of good things. And the irony is just the opposite seems to be happening, that democracy becomes meaningless, it becomes mob rule, and that this understanding of the ordered liberty that the founders gave us is so different from what we're talking about. This is sort of faux democracy.
Yeah, and I think that we feel that the citizens, the good citizens of America, need to speak up at this point. And this is, why, it goes back to your initial question, why did we write the book? We want everyone to know what's going on, and because we cannot rely on our political leaders to lead us. We have to lead them at this point.
What can we do to speak up? That's one question I wanted to throw out to all of you.
We need to become informed as Americans, and we need to use our citizenship to appeal to our political leaders. And we've written this book, but we've also want to introduce today, we're unveiling today, a new website called persecutionreport.org. And this website is an aggregator of all the top stories of religious freedom in the world. And it's going to be updated weekly, and it's going to cover all religious groups, not just Christians, and it's going to cover the whole world. But it's going to be a resource for the media, a resource for the average citizen, a resource for church groups, and anybody else, human rights groups, that want to know what is happening in the world today regarding persecution.
Did you say that's up today?
That's just being unveiled, just announced right now. It's breaking news.
Persecutionreport.org. Persecutionreport.org. Thank you.
Okay. Just in terms of what we can do, the answer is a whole lot. But just one story. Nina wrote a book 16 years ago, so did Lela and I, on the persecution of Christians. And in both those books, if you asked us, what's the worst place now, the answer was clear. It was Sudan. So it made a particular focus in subsequent years on Sudan. And there was tremendous lobbying in the United States. By a whole range of groups, but in terms of the number of bodies, most of them were dealing with Christians, because there are 350,000 congregations in this country, so you can mobilize far more people than, say, Amnesty International can. And with a particular focus on the Sudan, when the Bush administration and Colin Powell, when they came in, said, we're going to get rid of this whole idea of special envoys, it messes up the sort of lines of authority in the State Department. But against that pressure, there was strong lobbying by a coalition in the United States to have a special envoy for Sudan, which was granted. That was John Danforth, who did a very good job. And that there were many other countries involved. I don't just mean it was the American churches or the American government, but those were the central players. Those were the largest players. And that led to a ceasefire in Sudan, and then later on to a referendum and the creation of the newest country in the world. So that is quite an effort to actually make a new, create the conditions for a new country. Now that's not a thing you want everywhere, but it shows if there's a real focus on this sort of thing, it's amazing what can be achieved.
And the question would be, why did that happen? Why was there focus? Why do you think that this was different from some of what we're seeing now?
Could I just add a little footnote to what Paul said? The sequel is that the State Department Religious Freedom Report, when it came out last summer, noted that South Sudan, this place that had seen genocidal levels of religious persecution, had no reports of persecution whatsoever, or no even reports of discrimination, either by the government or by forces within society. So that's an amazing transformation.
But what do we think it was in 97 and onward? What do we think
One of the things,
happened?
Was the great Chuck Colson. We've lost him. And there have been other leaders that we've lost as well, like A.M. Rosenthal at the New York Times, who wrote dozens of columns about Christian persecution and the situation in Sudan at the time. So, and I think that there's a complacency. There was a complacency afterwards, after that success in Sudan, after that's the North-South conflict, of course, the Darfur and now the Nuba Mountains is dreadful, and the repression of Christians in North Sudan is horrible. But there was that success, and then there was the International Religious Freedom Act coalition that succeeded as well back in those days in the late 90s. So I think those two things, the coalition fell apart and thought that maybe with the mechanisms within the Religious Freedom Act, the government could take care of it. And no, we must be vigilant about our freedoms.
Since we were talking about North Korea a few moments ago, what do we think accounts for the reticence of the Koreans, the South Koreans? That is a vibrantly Christian nation, and I know that there are many very successful Korean American Christians. Are they not speaking up enough, and wouldn't that make a difference? And Paul, I know you had something to say as well.
Many of them are, and one story which needs some attention, actually one of our Hudson colleagues has written about, is the exodus of refugees in North Korea into China and of the Yalu River. And the networks which exist in China of a whole range of people, including mainly Koreans, mainly Korean Christians, who are working with them. This is the only real hole in that fortress of North Korea, and I think that sort of leakage may affect them. As to why the administration is worried, well, it's to do with nuclear weapons. At the moment, we are at war with North Korea. So those issues overshadow it. Of course, we're all worried about those as well. Those are very real things. But I worry about the fact that human rights questions are seen then as a side agenda to the realism of international relations, which in fact in many cases they're not. If we go back to the old example of the Soviet Union and the third basket of Helsinki, which was regarded as just little padding, keep the human rights NGOs happy, but had major effects with the Soviet Union of providing a treaty-based form of criticism. So these issues should be seen as it ties in with other foreign policy agendas. Tom Farr, now at Georgetown University, has written very eloquently on foreign policy and religious freedom.
I think we have time for one more question. Perhaps in the front row here, we've got a hand without a microphone approaching. And we only have just a moment left. So
Sandy Rios. Hi, Eric, and
Hi.
all of you. I was the president of the first North Korea Freedom Coalition, but I do a lot of other things, but that's relevant for here. I just wanted to mention something about the State Department, kind of a little history, not a long history. Just, we have an infiltration of Islamic sympathizers, and I am extremely concerned about that, and that needs to be stated. Whether it's Huma Abedin, I don't even know where she is now, but she has a very strong link to the Muslim Brotherhood. But just something broke yesterday, which answers your question, Eric. John Kerry's son-in-law, it didn't come out in the vetting process with him for Secretary of State. His son-in-law is an Iranian-American with very close relatives in Iran. And that is that's a breakdown in the vetting process. And so I'll ask you all, are you concerned about that?
I would have to know more about the Iranian. Most Iranian Americans are, of course, strong opponents of the Iranian regime. So I don't know about this person. I mean, this could be a problem too in terms of pressure and blackmail. I would be concerned about that. I would say if the State Department is now aware of that fact, they may be able to take steps to protect him in some way or put him into some other portfolio. But I don't know about the situation.
Since we're losing some media coverage, I just want to reiterate that there's a book called Persecuted, The Global Assault on Christians. 3 of the 3 authors are here on this panel. We're grateful for your time. Also, new website, persecutionreport.org. Please don't neglect to visit that and to keep up on these important issues, and maybe a round of applause for the authors of this brand new book. Thank you.